Story 1. I've never liked going to Walmart late at night. There's just something off about it. The place feels different when the crowds are gone, the aisles are almost deserted, and the employees are half hidden behind their pallets, restocking the shelves in eerie silence. But sometimes, you don't have a choice. It was just past midnight when I found myself pulling into the Walmart parking lot. I'd been putting off this trip all week. And of course, I had to do it when I was bone tired, and the rest of the world was asleep. The parking lot was vast, stretching out in front of the store, like an empty wasteland. A few scattered cars were parked under the dim glow of streetlights, their shadows long and distorted against the cracked pavement. The fluorescent lights from inside the store flickered out into the dark. But despite the brightness, the whole place felt shrouded in gloom. I couldn't shake the strange sense of unease that clung to me, even though I'd been to this exact Walmart late at night 100 times before. Tonight felt different. The slam of my car door echoed in the empty lot, sound unnervingly loud. As I locked the car, I instinctively glanced over my shoulder. There was nothing, just shadows and silence. I shook off the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I had a short list: burner ink, coffee, some snacks. No big deal. But even as I crossed the parking lot, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, as if someone was watching me. As I neared the entrance, I heard it, faint rustling sound. My steps faltered. I looked to my left where rows of parked cars lined the side of the lot. At first, I didn't see anything, but then from behind one of the cars, a figure emerged. He stepped out slowly, almost deliberately, as if he had been waiting for me. His clothes were wrinkled, and his hair was wild and unkempt. He looked disheveled. He hadn't slept in days. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, and they locked onto mine. Chill ran down my spine. For a second, I tried to rationalize it. He was probably just another late-night shopper, someone who'd come out for cigarettes or beer. There was something about the way he looked at me, something intense. His gaze wasn't casual, felt probing, like he was trying to figure me out. I forced a smile and kept walking, quickening my pace toward the automatic doors. I told myself he wasn't really paying attention to me, that he'd leave me alone. But then I heard his voice, hoarse and slurred like he had been yelling for hours. "Hey man," called out, his voice sharp in the still night air. "You got a minute?" I froze. His tone wasn't friendly, it was demanding, almost desperate. I turned slowly, trying to keep my cool as my heart began to race. "Sorry, I'm in a bit of a hurry," I said, my voice tight. But the man didn't take the hit. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving mine. "Just a second," he insisted. "I need to ask you something." His tone sent a shiver down my spine. I knew this wasn't a situation I wanted to be in, but a strange sense of politeness, or maybe fear, kept me from simply walking away. "Yeah?" I asked, my voice strained. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us. The smell hit me first: sweat, alcohol, something rotten. It was overwhelming, and I instinctively took a step back, but he matched it, still too close for comfort. "Do you know what time it is?" he asked. It was such an odd question, and there was something unsettling about the way he said it. I glanced at my phone, hoping to end the conversation quickly. "It's 12:15, I replied. He nodded slowly, but his eyes never left my face. 12:15, he repeated softly, almost to himself. "That's a good time. Real good time." My unease grew into full-blown dread. What the hell did that mean? I tried to back away again, but he stepped forward, closing the gap once more. His breath was hot and foul against my face as he leaned in, speaking in a low whisper. "You can't leave," he said, his voice trembling. "They're watching us." A cold wave of fear washed over me. "Who?" I stammered, trying to pull my arm free from his grip. "Who's watching?" His eyes darted around, wild with paranoia. "Them," he hissed. "The ones in the cars. The ones in the shadows." This guy wasn't just creepy. He was unhinged. My mind raced, panic setting in. I had to get away from him, fast. "I've got to go," I said firmly, trying to sound in control even though my heart was pounding in my chest. I yanked my arm free and took a quick step back, my body ready to bolt toward the store entrance. But before I could make my escape, his hand shot out and grabbed my arm again. This time, his grip was tighter, almost desperate. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with terror. "You don't understand," he whispered. They'll come for you too if you don't listen. They're here, right now. My body tensed, every muscle screaming at me to run. Somehow, I managed to jerk my arm out of his grasp and stumbled backward. "I don't know what you're talking about, man," I said, my voice shaky, "but I need to go." Without waiting for his response, I turned and bolted into the store, my heart racing as I made my way to the aisles. Inside, the fluorescent lights were bright, too bright, making the store feel artificial and exposed. The once comforting environment now felt alien. I grabbed a cart, trying to focus on my list. Printer ink, coffee, snacks. Just get what you need and get out, told myself, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the parking lot. His wild eyes, his cryptic words. Halfway through grabbing my items, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. I turned, and my stomach dropped. There he was, standing at the end of the aisle, his eyes still locked on me. He hadn't moved, hadn't even pretended to shop. He was just staring. I turned away quickly, pretending I hadn't seen him, but the fear was back in full force. I grabbed the rest of the items on my list as fast as I could, practically running to the self-checkout. My hands shook as I scanned my items, constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting him to appear behind me. When I finally finished, I hurried toward the exit, my mind racing. I needed to get to my car, to get home, to leave this entire nightmare behind. But as soon as I stepped outside, I saw him again, standing near the row of parked cars, his eyes still fixed on me. This time I didn't hesitate. I made a beeline for my car, unlocked it as quickly as possible, and threw myself inside. My hands shook so badly that I fumbled with the key before finally starting the engine. Just as I put the car in reverse, he appeared at my window, slamming his hands against the glass, his face twisted in fury. "You have to let me in," he screamed, his voice frantic. "They're coming. You don't understand." I hit the gas and sped out of the parking lot, my heart pounding as I watched him grow smaller in the rearview mirror. Even after I was miles away, his voice echoed in my mind. Story 2. My name is David Thompson, and what I'm about to tell you still sends shivers down my spine. It happened a few months ago during an unexpected mid-year break, time when schools were suddenly closed and businesses slowed down for a while. We thought it would be the perfect opportunity for a family trip, something fun to unwind. Little did we know that this supposed break from the hustle and bustle of life would bring us closer to something far more sinister than we ever imagined. Our family has always been close-knit. My dad, Robert, was the kind of person who always made sure we had everything we needed. And my mom, Elizabeth, was the heart of our family, keeping everyone grounded. Then there was my little brother, Ethan, curious, full of energy, and always eager to explore. Joining us were my cousins, Sarah and Jake, kids of my dad's brother, Mark. Sarah was always adventurous, while Jake, though younger, had a wild imagination that always made our family trips entertaining. We decided to head out for a few days and take a drive up to the forests near Charleston, South Carolina. My dad thought it would be a great idea to surprise us with a jungle safari, something we'd been talking about for a while. We packed our things and set out in our trusty silver Ford Explorer, blasting music and joking around as we cruised down Interstate 95. We were that family who loved to tell horror stories. I know, weird, right? But we were always fascinated by the unknown, the unexplainable. It made road trips more fun. My parents didn't love it. They always told us not to scare each other too much. But for us, the thrill was part of the excitement. As we drove, the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in hues of red and orange. We hadn't eaten since breakfast, so naturally, when we saw a subway sign glowing in the distance, we all agreed to stop. It was the kind of place that looked like it had been there forever, rustic, old, tucked between some overgrown trees and a dusty parking lot. Kind of place you'd think twice about visiting at night. Hunger always wins. We pulled in and parked the car, and without thinking much about it, we hurried inside. The place was fairly empty, save for a couple of truckers sitting in the back. The lights flickered slightly, and the air had that faint scent of old bread and cleaning products that didn't quite mask the stale air. We didn't care. We just wanted to eat. We ordered our sandwiches and found a booth by the window, overlooking the parking lot. It was quiet outside, with just the sounds of the highway in the distance. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. When we finished eating, we headed back out to the lot, only to find the car missing. My dad's face went pale. He realized he had left the keys in the ignition. In that moment, panic hit us all. A rush of confusion and dread washed over me as I looked around, expecting to see our Ford right where we left it. But it was gone. My mom immediately suggested calling the police, but before we could act, we noticed a rundown motel next to the subway, a place called the Oldtown Inn. It wasn't much to look at, but it was the only option we had for the night. The sun was setting fast, and with no car, no other options, and the police telling us it might take hours to recover the vehicle, we reluctantly checked into the motel. The place was eerie, faded wallpaper peeling off the walls, and a damp smell that clung to the air. The woman behind the counter, an older lady with glasses hanging low on her nose, handed us the keys without much emotion. "Room 13, she said, not looking up from her crossword puzzle. We exchanged nervous glances, but took the keys and made our way to the room. Room 13 was on the second floor, overlooking the subway. The hallways were narrow, dimly lit by flickering lights. Creaking of the wooden floor beneath our feet only added to the unsettling atmosphere. By the time we reached our room, we were all exhausted from the day's events, but we tried to make the best of it. The room itself was cold and musty, with old furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. A small TV sat in the corner, its screen covered in dust. Despite the rundown feel, we tried to lighten the mood. We joked about the situation, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in our stomachs. After all, it was just one night. Tomorrow, we'd get our car back, and everything would return to normal. That night, normal was the furthest thing from reality. Ethan, Sarah, Jake, and I shared a room. My parents were in the room next door. After a while, Ethan, being the night owl he was, convinced us to watch some horror videos on his phone. It was something we did often, but with everything that had happened, felt like we were tempting fate. Around midnight, we started to feel hungry again. Remembering that the subway was open 24/7, we decided to head back there to grab something to eat. We quietly slipped out of the room, not wanting to wake our parents, and made our way downstairs. The streets were eerily silent, with only the occasional car passing by on the highway in the distance. As we approached the subway, Ethan suddenly said he needed to use the restroom. Sarah and Jake agreed to wait with him, so I went inside to order. The restroom was located in the back corner of the restaurant, near the kitchen. Sarah told me later that the lights in the hallway leading to the restroom flickered as they waited outside. After what felt like an eternity, a man finally emerged from the restroom. Sarah and Jake both described him as tall, with an unsettling look in his eyes. He didn't say a word as he hurried past them, his steps heavy and deliberate. They both felt a chill run down their spines, but didn't mention it to Ethan, who was now rushing into the restroom himself. While I waited in line, I could feel an odd tension in the air. The few people who were inside the subway were eerily quiet, almost like they weren't real. As I picked up our sandwiches and made my way back to the restroom area, I found Sarah and Jake standing outside the restroom, their faces pale. "What's wrong?" I asked. "It's Ethan," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We can't get him out. The door won't open." I rushed over and tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. From the other side of the door, we could hear Ethan's muffled voice, panicked and scared. He kept saying that the door had slammed shut on its own and that something wasn't right. At that moment, I noticed something even more disturbing. The lights above us were flickering again, but this time they seemed to sync with a strange noise coming from down the hallway. A soft, almost rhythmic tapping sound. Footsteps. We all turned to look, but no one was there. I banged on the door, calling out to Ethan, telling him to stay calm. Sarah started to cry, and Jake stood frozen in place. Felt like time had stopped, the air around us growing colder by the second. After what felt like an eternity, the door suddenly flew open, and Ethan stumbled out, his face pale and covered in sweat. He couldn't explain what had happened. All he could say was that he had seen someone in the mirror, someone who wasn't him. We grabbed our food and raced back to the motel, barely saying a word. Once inside our room, we locked the door and tried to shake off the terror we had just experienced. But that night, none of us could sleep. Every creak, every flicker of the lights felt like a warning. We were not alone. The next morning, the police called to inform us they had found our car. But even the relief of that couldn't erase what had happened the night before. We packed up and left the motel as quickly as we could, never looking back. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced in that subway or why the restroom door refused to open. But one thing is for sure, it's a night I'll never forget. Do you think you know what might have happened? Drop a comment below. Story 3. When you're surrounded by people, those creaks and groans of an old house blend into the background, barely registering in your mind. But when it's just you, those sounds become louder, more insistent, like the house itself is trying to get your attention. That's what I was thinking about the night it happened. I was 16, and my parents, Megan and David Holloway, were out for the evening, leaving me alone in our house at the edge of Whispering Pines, a small town in the dense forests of Washington state. It wasn't the first time I'd been left by myself, but there was something different about that night, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The house was quiet, kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. I had my homework spread out on the kitchen table, but I wasn't really paying attention to it. The TV was on in the living room, casting a soft glow across the room. The muffled sounds of a sitcom drifted through the air, mixing with the occasional creak of the house as it settled. Outside, the sun had long since set, and the world beyond the windows was shrouded in darkness. Our house backed onto the Olympic National Forest, the trees pressing in close like silent sentinels. During the day, forest was beautiful, a place where I could lose myself in nature, surrounded by the scent of pine and the rustle of leaves. But at night, those same trees took on a different character. They became a wall of blackness, a place where anything could be hiding just out of sight. I wasn't scared, not really. I had grown up in these woods, used to the way they seemed to close in around the house at night. But as I sat there, my pen tapping idly against my notebook, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started with a sound, faint, distant noise that barely registered at first. It paused, my pen hovering over the paper, and listened. Nothing. Just the usual creak of the house, the low hum of the refrigerator, and the laugh track from the TV in the other room. I shrugged it off and went back to my homework, but a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, more distinct, a voice, faint, but unmistakable, and it was coming from the woods. I put down my pen, my heart skipping a beat as I strained to listen. The voice was distant, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, but I could hear the urgency in it, the way it seemed to reach out, begging for someone to listen. Help. Please help. I frowned, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It didn't sound like anything out of the ordinary, just someone in trouble. But the woods were dense, thick with underbrush and uneven terrain. It wasn't a place you'd wander into by accident, especially not at night. I stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the backyard. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the trees, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just the same dark shapes of the forest, the same stillness that had always been there. The voice didn't stop. Help. It was a woman's voice, soft and pleading, growing a little louder with each repetition. My first instinct was to run outside, to see if someone really needed help. But something held me back. There was something off about that voice, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was too faint, too distant, like it wasn't really coming from the woods at all, from somewhere else entirely. Help. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. I couldn't just ignore it. What if someone was really in trouble? The more I listened, the more I felt that gnawing sense of unease, like something wasn't right. Finally, I made up my mind. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, my hand trembling slightly as I flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the backyard as I stepped outside. The night was cold, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. Trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, but the voice had stopped. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting to hear it again. But the woods were silent, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the wind. I should have gone back inside. I should have locked the door and forgotten about it. But something compelled me to move forward, take a few tentative steps toward the edge of the woods. Help. The voice was louder now, closer, like it was coming from just beyond the tree line. I felt a chill run down my spine. But I kept moving, my flashlight casting long shadows across the ground. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. For a moment, there was no response. And then the voice came again, clear and sharp. "Help me, please." It was so close now, so real that I almost believed it. Almost. But there was something wrong with the way the voice echoed through the trees, something unnatural about the way it seemed to bounce off the trunks and come from every direction at once. I stopped, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I pointed it into the woods. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to go inside and lock the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, voice stopped. I stood there, frozen in place, the flashlight casting a jittery beam of light across the trees. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I was about to turn back, retreat to the safety of the house, when I heard a new sound, a rustling in the bushes just ahead. I pointed the flashlight toward the sound, the beam illuminating the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing, just the same dark shapes of the trees, the same tangle of underbrush. But then I caught a glimpse of movement, figure, standing just beyond the reach of the light, barely visible in the shadows. My heart lurched in my chest, and I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, so intense that I almost dropped the flashlight. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was it? What did they want? Why were they just standing there, hiding in the darkness? And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing where the voice had come from, but it hadn't moved. It had been there the whole time, which meant the voice hadn't been moving through the woods. It had been coming from that exact spot, as if the figure had been calling out to me. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was barely more than a silhouette, but there was something wrong with the way it was standing. The way its body seemed to blend into the shadows, like it wasn't entirely there. I knew I had to get out of there. I knew I had to turn around and run back to the house, but my legs felt like lead. My feet rooted to the ground as I stared at the figure, unable to look away. And then, slowly, the figure began to move, stepping forward just enough to come into the light. Story 4. It was supposed to be a chill night. My parents, David and Emily Carter, had gone out for a dinner party, leaving me home alone for the first time in what felt like forever. I was 16, living in a quiet suburb of Denver, Colorado, and finally trusted enough to hold down the fort by myself. I was looking forward to it. No younger siblings to bother me, no parents telling me to turn off the TV or do my homework. Just me, bowl of popcorn, and hours of uninterrupted video games. The house was eerily quiet, a kind of silence that only comes when everyone else is gone. It was comforting at first, a peaceful kind of stillness that made the whole place feel like it was truly mine. I settled into my favorite spot on the couch, game controller in hand, and lost myself in the pixelated world on the screen. But as the hours ticked by, that silence began to change. Clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen became more pronounced, and every small noise in the house made me pause, my heart skipping a beat. I told myself it was nothing. Old houses make noises, and I was just being paranoid. Besides, I was having fun, and I wasn't about to let a few creaky floorboards ruin my night. Then, just as I was about to finish a particularly tough level, something caught my eye. Movement outside the window. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the game on the glass, trick of the light. But when I glanced over, I saw it clearly. Figure sitting on the deck. My heart skipped a beat, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. The deck was right outside the living room window, visible from where I was sitting. But the figure was positioned so that I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body, hunched over, almost as if they were waiting for something. I paused the game, my hands suddenly clammy around the controller. I squinted, trying to make out who it was. Maybe it was one of my friends playing a prank on me or a neighbor who had wandered over. But as I watched, the figure turned slightly. I caught a glimpse of their face. It wasn't anyone I knew. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. The figure was a man, older than me, probably in his late 30s or early 40s. He had short dark hair and was wearing a plain hoodie, the hood pulled up to obscure most of his face. But what I could see was enough to send a chill down my spine. He was smiling. Not a friendly smile, but a wide, unsettling grin that stretched across his face as if he found something incredibly amusing. His eyes were fixed on the house, but didn't seem to focus on anything in particular, just staring, unblinking. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. This wasn't normal. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't supposed to be here. I considered going outside to confront him. Something held me back. There was something about the way he was sitting there, so still, so silent, that made me feel like I shouldn't get any closer. Instead, I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise, and moved to the window for a better look. The man didn't react, didn't even seem to notice me. He just kept staring ahead, that eerie grin never leaving his face. And then he started to laugh. It was a strange laugh, barely audible through the glass. But I could see his shoulders shaking, his chest rising and falling with silent chuckle. There was no sound, just the movement, like he was laughing at a joke only he could hear. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. This wasn't just some random guy. He was clearly not right in the head, and he was sitting on my deck laughing to himself. I took a step back, my mind racing with what to do next. My parents weren't going to be home for hours, and I didn't want to call them and freak them out unless it was absolutely necessary. But I couldn't just ignore this either. I decided to lock the doors. At least that way, if he tried to come inside, he wouldn't be able to get in. I moved quickly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I locked the front door, then the back door, making sure every window was securely shut. The whole time, I could feel the man's presence on the deck, that silent laughter echoing in my mind. When I returned to the living room to check the sliding glass door that led to the deck, my heart nearly stopped. The man was standing right up against the glass, his face inches from the door. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table as I scrambled away from the door. The man was still grinning, his hands pressed flat against the glass, his breath fogging up the window. I could see him more clearly now. Pale, sickly tone of his skin, the dark circles under his eyes, and that grin. It was like he was enjoying this, like he knew exactly how terrified I was and was relishing every second of it. I wanted to scream, call for help. My voice caught in my throat. Instead, I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to put as much distance between myself and that door as possible. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, his eyes tracking my every step. And then, without warning, he reached for the door handle. My breath hitched as I realized what he was trying to do. He was going to come inside. I bolted for the door, reaching it just as the handle started to turn. I yanked it back, locking it with trembling hands, just as the man pulled on the handle from the other side. For a moment, we were face to face, separated only by the thin pane of glass. I could see the amusement in his eyes, twisted pleasure he was getting out of this. He tugged on the door again, harder this time, but it held firm. I stepped back, my mind racing. What was he going to do next? Would he try to break the glass? Was he armed? I didn't know, and the uncertainty was almost worse than anything else. But then, to my surprise, the man let go of the handle. He stepped back, his grin widening as he tapped the glass with his finger, like he was playing some kind of game. And then he laughed again, a soundless, eerie laugh that made my skin crawl. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My heart was pounding in my chest as I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to the panic I tried to explain what was happening, but my words came out in a rush, almost incoherent. There's a man on my deck trying to get inside. He's just standing there laughing. The operator assured me that the police were on their way, but it felt like an eternity before I heard the distant wail of sirens. I stayed on the phone, my eyes glued to the crack under the door, half expecting to see shadows moving outside. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if the man broke in before the police arrived? What if he wasn't alone? But then, just as I was about to lose hope, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps outside, followed by loud knocks on the front door. "Police, open up." I almost cried with relief. I unlocked my bedroom door and ran to the front door, throwing it open. 2 officers stood there, their faces serious but reassuring. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, his voice calm but urgent. I nodded, still shaken. He was on the deck, trying to get inside. The officers exchanged a glance. Then one of them motioned for me to stay inside while they checked the perimeter. I watched from the doorway as they moved around the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But when they returned, their expressions were grim. "We didn't find anyone," one of them said. "Are you sure he was out there?" I nodded, feeling a fresh wave of fear. He was right there at the door. The officer sighed, glancing at his partner. "We'll file a report and have someone keep an eye on the area tonight. But if you see anything else, anything at all, call us immediately." I nodded numbly, the reality of what had happened finally sinking in. The man was gone, but the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The police stayed for a while, making sure the house was secure and taking down my statement. They tried to reassure me, telling me it was probably just a vagrant or someone playing a prank, but I could see the concern in their eyes. When they finally left, I was alone again. The silence of the house was now oppressive. I couldn't bring myself to go back to the living room to face the sliding glass door where the man had been standing. Instead, I stayed in my room, every little noise making me jump. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that grin, those dark, soulless eyes staring back at me. I kept imagining him coming back, finding a way inside, and what would happen if he did. When my parents finally came home in the early hours of the morning, I was a mess. I tried to explain what had happened, but it was hard to put into words the sheer terror I had felt. They were understandably worried and upset, but I could tell they didn't fully grasp the gravity of what I'd experienced. The next few days were tense. My parents took extra precautions, installing new locks and a security system. The police kept an eye on the area, but the man never showed up again. I went back to my routine, but the house didn't feel the same. The quiet was no longer comforting. It was unsettling, as if it was hiding something just out of sight. The man's presence on my deck that night was a nightmare that seemed too vivid to be just a figment of my imagination. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of my eye reminded me of that night. It's been a while now, but I still find myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see that grin in the dark. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting, or if it was just a random encounter, fleeting moment of terror that happened to coincide with an otherwise ordinary night. Either way, it left a mark on me that won't easily fade. The house may be safe again. The fear lingers, a reminder of the night I was alone and found myself face to face with something truly unsettling. Story 5. It was one of those nights I'd been out late at a friend's house, enjoying some laughs, a few drinks, and a lot of meaningless conversations. It wasn't anything wild, just a quiet evening of catching up. But by the time I decided to leave, it was nearing midnight, and the streets were almost completely deserted. I liked driving at night. That night, as I pulled onto the highway, I noticed my fuel gauge dipping alarmingly close to empty. I sighed. Of course, I hadn't thought about it earlier, and out here in the middle of nowhere, there was only one option: a small 24-hour gas station I'd passed a few miles back. It was one of those places that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 80s. The neon sign outside flickered weakly, half the letters missing or burnt out. I pulled in under the dull glow of the single overhead light, parked beside the pump, and turned off the engine. The station was completely empty. No other cars, no sign of life inside the convenience store. Just me, and the eerie stillness of the night. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it. That strange sensation that comes over you when you're completely alone, but somehow you feel watched. I shook off the feeling and grabbed my wallet, telling myself I was being ridiculous. It was just late. I was tired. I started pumping gas, leaning against the car while the fuel flowed. I stared off into the distance, listening to the soft buzz of the overhead light and the rhythmic click of the gas pump. It should have been calming. The silence felt oppressive. The more I stood there, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced around the lot again. Nothing. Just the same empty lot, the same dimly lit station. No movement, no cars passing on the highway. Then I saw it. Tucked under my windshield wiper was a small piece of paper. I frowned, staring at the note for a few seconds before curiosity got the better of me. I finished pumping the gas, put the nozzle back in its place, and cautiously walked around the car. The note was small, folded haphazardly, the edges worn as if it had been crumpled in someone's hand. I pulled it out from under the wiper and unfolded it. My heart inexplicably pounded in my chest. Scrawled in messy, almost frantic handwriting were 3 words: "I'm here." My breath caught in my throat. I glanced around the lot again, my eyes darting between the rows of darkened pumps and the empty street beyond. But there was no one, just the same stillness, the same silence. I could feel my pulse quicken, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. It was probably a joke, I told myself. Someone messing around. Maybe it was from earlier in the evening when I'd parked downtown, and I just hadn't noticed it until now. That had to be it, right? Still, my mind raced with every worst-case scenario. What if someone had been following me, watching me? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I stuffed the note into my pocket and quickly climbed back into the car, locking the doors as soon as I was inside. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. I pulled out of the lot faster than I intended, the tires skidding slightly on the pavement as I hit the road. My heart was still pounding, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Nothing, just the empty road behind me. But that didn't stop the feeling that I was being followed, watched. As I drove, I couldn't stop thinking about the note. The words were burned into my mind, repeating over and over again. I'm here. Who would do something like that? And why? The road stretched out before me, long and dark, the streetlights few and far between. Every time I passed through a patch of light, I felt exposed, like I was stepping into someone's line of sight. Each shadow seemed to shift, morphing into something more menacing, more sinister. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, but the road remained dark. I wasn't that far from home, 15 minutes maybe less, but it felt like every mile was dragging on for hours. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe some teenager thought it'd be funny to leave a creepy note on a random car. Maybe someone was trying to spook people at the gas station for kicks. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. Really watching me. Then, as I approached the last stretch of road before my house, I saw it. Parked. It was pulled over on the side of the road, its headlights off, barely visible in the darkness. My heart lurched in my chest as I drove past, looking over at the vehicle. For a split second, I thought I saw someone sitting in the driver's seat, their figure barely illuminated by the faint light from my car's headlights. I forced myself to keep driving, my hands trembling on the wheel. I pulled into my driveway, my heart still racing, and shut off the engine. My house was dark as expected, with only the porch light casting a small pool of light over the front door. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. Even though I was home, the feeling of unease hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown worse. I grabbed my things and stepped out of the car, my eyes darting around the yard, the street, and the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long under the faint streetlights. Then I saw it. Another note, tucked under the same windshield wiper where the first had been. My blood ran cold as I slowly approached the car, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I hadn't been out of the car for more than a few minutes, and yet somehow, there it was. Another folded piece of paper, just like before. My hands were trembling as I pulled it out, my mind racing with question. How when? I unfolded the note, my heart pounding in my chest as I read the words. I told you I'm here. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, my vision blurring for a moment as a wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't some random note left on a whim. Someone had followed me. Someone had been watching me this whole time. I quickly unlocked the front door, rushing inside and locking it behind me. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. How had they followed me? How had they gotten that second note on my car so quickly? Where were they now? I paced the living room, watching out the window every few seconds, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. But the street outside was empty, as silent and still as it had been before. I pulled out my phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing 911. I didn't know what else to do. Someone had followed me home, someone had left those notes, and I wasn't taking any chances. The operator answered quickly, her voice calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency? I think someone's been following me, I stammered, my voice shaking. They left notes on my car twice. One at a gas station, and now here at my house. Are you in a safe place right now? She asked, her tone steady. Yeah, I'm inside my house. Stay inside. Lock all the doors. We're sending someone out to your location. I thanked her before hanging up. My mind was racing. I tried to think of who could have done this. I didn't have enemies. I didn't know anyone who would do something like this to mess with me. I moved to the window again, carefully pulling back the curtain just enough to see outside. The car I had seen earlier, the one parked on the side of the road, was now in front of my house. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the car, its headlights still off, its figure barely visible in the dark. The engine was off, but I could see the outline of someone sitting in the driver's seat. My stomach twisted into a tight knot. Whoever it was, they were waiting. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding so loudly that I could hear it in my ears. The silence in the house was deafening. I grabbed my phone again, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911 for the second time that night. Please, I whispered when the operator answered. Someone's outside my house. My hands shook as I gripped the phone tightly, waiting for the operator to pick up. I could barely breathe, my heart pounding so hard in my chest that I thought it might burst. The car was still sitting there, motionless, but I could feel the presence of the person inside watching me. The whole situation felt like something out of a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice came through the phone, calm and professional, but I was too panicked to keep it together. There's someone outside my house, I whispered, my voice trembling. They've been following me. I think they're watching me right now. Are you inside your home with the doors locked? Yes, I replied, glancing around the dark living room. The windows felt too exposed. I moved to the hallway, trying to find a place where I felt safer. Stay calm. We're sending a unit to your location. Try to stay out of sight and keep your doors locked. I'm trying, I said, my voice barely audible. I hung up and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The car was still there, parked right in front of my house. I could see the dim glow of the interior lights reflecting off the windshield. I felt like I was in a suspenseful movie, waiting for the climax. My hands were still shaking, my heart racing with every passing second. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. Every little sound outside made me jump. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the distant howl of a coyote, and the occasional rustling of leaves. But the car outside remained still and silent, a dark sentinel watching my house. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the distant sound of sirens approaching. Relief washed over me as the flashing lights of the patrol car illuminated the street. I peeked out the window again and saw the police vehicle pull up to my driveway. The officers got out of their car and approached my house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I opened the door, my hands still shaking as I greeted them. The officers quickly assessed the situation, their expressions serious. They walked over to the car parked outside, their flashlights scanning the area. I watched from the safety of my doorway, my anxiety slowly giving way to exhaustion. The car was still there, but the person inside was nowhere to be seen. The officers conducted a thorough search of the area but found no trace of anyone. After a while, the officers came back to the house. We didn't find anyone, one of them said. The car was abandoned, and there's no sign of anyone in the vicinity. I nodded, trying to calm my racing heart. Thank you. I don't know what's going on, but this is really unsettling. We'll have an officer patrol the area tonight, the officer assured me. If you notice anything suspicious, don't hesitate to call us again. I thanked them and watched as they left. The car outside remained empty, its presence no longer as menacing as it had been. I locked the door behind me and turned off the lights, trying to settle my nerves. It was late, and I was exhausted. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me. The night felt endless, the silence heavy and oppressive. As I lay there, trying to fall asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. The note, the car, the sense of being followed. It all lingered in my mind. I closed my eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, but sleep eluded me. I spent the rest of the night in a restless state, every sound making me jump, every shadow seeming to shift and move. In the morning, the sun rose with a false sense of security, and I managed to get some rest. The unease from that night stayed with me, a lingering reminder that sometimes, even in the most familiar places, something unsettling can lurk just out of sight.